Okay, we're back and we're going to talk about sex and gender. And first off, let's discuss the difference between the term sex and the term gender. So, biological sex is the term that we use to refer to the chromosomes that can determine your sex, the gonads that you have that can produce the hormones that are typically associated with one sex or the other, and then the type of genitals that the person has. Gender, on the other hand, is much more socialized, much more variable. So I've got this infographic that I pulled down. Historically, the American Psychological Association has made a distinction between the word sex and the word gender. As long as I've been in psychology, that's been the distinction. And when you're talking about males versus females, you use the word sex. And when you're talking about people who are more masculine or feminine or androgynous or whatever, you use the word gender. Things have gotten a lot more confused over the past 10 years, probably, where the words are being mixed and mutated. And so they're meaning different things. And so it can be really tricky to be using words in a way that convey what you mean to say and stuff like that. I'm going to stick with the APA's guidelines, and I'm going to use the word sex when I'm talking about the biological factors. I'm going to use the word gender when I mean the socialized or internalized sort of cognitive part of gender. Okay. So let's talk about the biological sex aspects. So first off, chromosomal sex. So the chromosomes are what activate the HPA axis that end up having an impact on things like genital sex and hormonal sex and things like that. So it's really important to start with this HPA axis. So the H in the HPA axis is the hypothalamus. That's a structure in the brain that is in the limbic system. It's in charge of a lot of our sort of maintenance activities. It's what makes you hungry. It's what makes you feel full. It makes you thirsty, all of those kinds of things. It's also got a region that's largely responsible for sexual desire, arousal, things like that. So the hypothalamus is able to control the endocrine system, which is your hormonal system, by activating the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is technically outside of the brain. It's attached to the hypothalamus, but it's not embedded inside of the brain. It's kind of hanging off in a little pouch away from the brain. So the hypothalamus secretes corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, which in turn causes the anterior pituitary gland to activate the adrenal cortex with adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then the adrenal gland secretes a hormone that you may have heard of before called cortisol. And when the cortisol levels get high enough in the blood, that gets picked up by the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and that causes them to stop secreting their hormones because they're like, okay, well, we got enough cortisol in the blood now. When the cortisol gets too low, then that gets back to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, and it causes them to secrete their hormones to trigger more cortisol to be released by the adrenal glands. So that's the HPA axis. So the chromosomes that a person possesses in utero, so in the first 7 weeks after conception, the chromosomes that they possess will determine how this HPA axis works. Then the HPA axis is going to have an impact on the gonadal sex. So gonadal sex, so in the top picture is what an undifferentiated embryo looks like prior to exposure to the HPA axis. So what we're seeing here are structures of the reproductive tract that are undifferentiated. So you see, for example, there in the middle it says testes and ovaries pointing at the same structure. This is what we call a gonad. It's in the presence of masculinizing hormones. It'll take on the form of a testis. In the absence of masculinizing hormones, it'll turn into an ovary. So we see other things there too, the paramesophrenic duct, the mesophrenic duct. These things all are going to react to the hormones that are coming out of the HPA axis. And so if the process is masculinizing, it'll go down the left-hand side where you end up with the structures that are there, the male structures. If those masculinizing ones are not present, then it goes down the female side and you end up with the ovary and the fallopian tube and so on. So gonadal sex is determined by exposure to this HPA axis. Gonadal sex then causes hormonal sex, because if you have a testis, that's going to produce androgens. And what we see here in fetal age is that the testes have a burst of testosterone between 8 and 12 weeks after conception. And then the serum, that's the blood measure of it, it hangs around up until about 16 weeks after conception, and then it drops off for the rest of pregnancy. Those androgens are going to have impacts on the developing brain and other things that are going on inside the fetus that has testes. So the release of androgens are really important for shaping a lot of the brain structures, and then also the external structures and things that are going to be going on. So with the female, it's not that some kind of female hormone is released. Instead, it's that androgens are not released. So in the absence of androgens, then the female structures develop, the brain gets, it's going to take on the more female pattern and so on. So hormonal sex has a big impact on the developing brain. So here's an average of PET scans. These are actually, they're functional magnetic resonance imagery pictures, and it's a bunch of different participants all being scanned, and then they looked for similarities and differences between males and females. If the female had a larger volume area, it's colored in red, and if the male had a larger volume area, it's colored in blue. And if it's tending towards yellow, that means that the female had way larger and volume, and if it's tending towards that light blue, then that's the males had much larger volume. And so you can see that there are a lot of areas of the brain that are different sized between males and females, and that structural difference is attributed to exposure to hormones during fetal development. So it's really important to take a moment to say, on average, this is these MRIs are not any individual. This is on average a bunch of males and a bunch of females. So any individual female may have a brain that looks more like the average male, and vice versa. But on average, we see these differences between male and female brains. Here we have another way of sort of describing differences. Here I gave you a picture for reference at the bottom to show you how this brain on the top is actually being imaged. So it's being imaged from like the center out, and so what you're seeing in the bottom, you can see that there's the cortex at the top, that part that looks kind of like cauliflower, right? The baby blue part in the bottom picture is the hippocampus and the connections to it. The lavender part there is the amygdala. You can see that yellow part in the middle, which is the pons, and then you've got the green part underneath the, I called it the pons, it's the thalamus, sorry. So the yellow part is the thalamus, below it is the hypothalamus, and it's green. And then there, see the pituitary gland that's yellow? That's that anterior pituitary that I was talking about in the previous discussion. So this kind of gets you an orientation to the brain in general. Now let's look at that volume distinction. So if it's pink, that means that women have larger volumes, and it's supposed to be, my legend is off. The little thing that says men larger volumes should be blue. So if it's blue, then men have larger volumes. If it's pink, then women have larger volumes. And again, these are averages across lots of different scans. And you can see a lot of areas that are pink and several areas that are blue. One of the biggest areas that's pink there is actually the corpus callosum, which is that band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. You can also see that pink area right above the corpus callosum. That's the parietal lobe, and that's an area that integrates a lot of information. So there are some pretty big differences. The blue area for the male, that's there in the middle, indicating that the male has larger volume there. That's that inferior corpus callosum area. And so there's like very distinct differences in the average shape of the male brain versus the average shape of the female brain. So here we've got the scientific labeling for how they differ. So we've got the female brain with their shopping lobe and their bad hair day lobe and their chocolate lobe. And then you got the male brain with the big sex area and the lame excuses gland. And yeah. So obviously this is a joke. This is not how the brain is organized. While there are sex differences in structures and volumes and things like that, the brains are organized basically the same. But this is a good cartoon because I wanted to shift over to how we develop our own gender identity. And these are the kinds of messages that we get as males and females, right? We get oftentimes people will provide to us stereotypes of people of our own sex or people of the other sex, and we start to get impressions that we should be this way or our partner should be that way, or right, and we have expectations for ourselves and others that are all wrapped up in what we would call gender identity, right? In our own interpretation of what all this stuff means is part of our gender identity. All right, so gender identity can be defined as the gender that the person identifies the most with. And one of the biggest influences on gender identity is socialization. So when we talk about socialization, we have things like, we've got two stick figures on the left, must be two boys, because when the one isn't very good at it, the other one says, wow, you suck at math. Now we have the ones on the right, and they put longer hair on the one on the right, so I'm guessing that one's the girl. And when that one's not very good, the other one says, wow, girls suck at math. Like, this is sort of the message that we get with those stereotypes that people provide to us, right? Like the brains that I showed you on the last slide, or this kind of cartoon, like the idea that when it's somebody like me, you know, somebody of my same sex who's behaving differently, I can say, well, that's you, that's an idiosyncrasy that you have. When it's someone from the other group, I can say, wow, people in your group are different from me, right? And that's the basis of, you know, those socialized stereotypes. Parents provide some of that stereotyping for us. They do it through completely unconscious methods. Like, for example, in this Norman Rockwell picture, you know, mom's been home baking the cake, dad gets home from work. You know, the kids get this impression that this is what moms do and this is what dads do, right? Which is really funny because they really do internalize that whatever mom does is what moms do, and whatever dad does is what dads do. So that even if you think you're really hip, like I think I am, man, hip yo, and you do a little gender bending, right? Where I'm the full-time breadwinner and my husband stayed home full-time with the kids. Like, literally, that was his career, was he stayed home with the kids. And so when my son was getting older, I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he goes, with this very perplexed, like, what are you even talking about? He goes, a dad. Like, that's the job, right? Like, your dad had all sorts of careers before you came along, but okay. He had actually internalized that dads just stay home. And it didn't, you know, help that his best friends in the neighborhood, their dad was a nurse who, you know, works a ambulance, and their mom was a firefighter. So I think he got the impression that basically parents don't work, because the dad in that family would be gone for like 24 hours at a stretch, and then he'd be home for 2 days or something, and then mom would be gone for 2 days and then home for a day. And so I think he only went over there when like the dad would be home alone. So he's like, well, dad, stay home. He's like got this really, you know, backwards view of just same gender stereotypes, right? Like he got the same stereotyping, he just had the sexes backwards. So sometimes it's done, and I wasn't doing any of that on purpose, and my husband wasn't doing anything on purpose. It just sometimes gets conveyed to the kids, and you don't even know you're giving them a message. I saw a quotable, what was it called? Humor at Work or something in the Reader's Digest, where this female pilot was going to be captaining the plane for the first time. So the dad brought the kids down to see mommy getting ready to take off for the first time. And the co-pilot says to the little boy, when you grow up, do you want to be a pilot like your mom? And he goes, no, pilots are girls. So he, again, had just flipped what the expectation was. So it's not like you broaden your children's minds necessarily by, being in different roles. It just causes them to think, well, people with your sex do that. So some of it's unconscious. Some of it's more conscious, making choices for your kids when they, haven't really expressed an interest or whatever. And you say, well, it's time to sign my child up for an extracurricular activity. And I'm putting the boys in sports and I'm putting the girls in dance. When the child hasn't expressed an interest in one or the other, and you're imposing what you think they'll like, or putting your child who is your same sex into the stuff that you liked when you were little or whatever, that's a little bit more conscious, parents trying to shape their child towards, certain things. But a lot of times parents are reacting to what their kids are putting out. The kids may be expressing their desires pretty clearly. I got a couple of grandchildren, and one's a girl and one's a boy. And the girl, she was always really interested in engaging with us. And, if there was a toy, she wanted to, see how we touched it and, those kinds of things. She liked the ones that talked more when she was a toddler. And my grandson just likes anything that has buttons or wheels or can move, anything like that. He likes to do it by himself. He wants to manipulate everything. I had the most horrifying experience yesterday where they were over here, and my son and I were making air pop popcorn, and that was really interesting to my granddaughter. And she was telling us that she wanted some, and she really likes popcorn, and she was giving us just this play-by-play about the popcorn. And I thought my grandson was off with other people in the other room, but apparently he toddled past us. Suddenly my granddaughter goes silent, and that caught my attention because that was an unusual event. So I look over, and my grandson is handing her one of my dishwasher pods, and he's about to put one in his mouth. I'm like, no, where did you come from? She has in her entire life never gotten into the dishwasher pods that are under my sink, but he just toddled over there, and he quietly got into it. So everything's tied shut now, so don't worry. But Grandma learned a lesson, and just the interest that he's displaying already seem like we're fostering things that he's expressing interest. So every one of us, unbeknownst to each other, we all bought him his first birthday present was a truck. Luckily, we all bought him a different one. So he's got a big truck, a small truck. He's got a set of 3 that can go in the bathtub. He's got like all these trucks. All of us bought him the same thing, and we all said, well, I noticed that he was really liking things with wheels. So sometimes the parents are reacting to what the child's putting out. Sometimes they are imposing things on their children, and really the child would have picked something else if they'd had a choice. Now, we've talked a little bit about how important peers are for socialization. I'm going to go ahead and take a break here. We're going to come back in the next video, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how important they are for gender identity development.